general overview. So exam 2 is going to cover the skeletal system, the joints, the muscles, and the nervous. And just to go through the logistics. So same thing as exam 1. So make sure that, well, you can't take it unless you have respondents lockdown working. You also have to have webcam. And what's really important is to make sure that you do the environmental scan correctly. Now, I didn't, unless the respondents lockdown flags you, I didn't mention anything, but I did go through and look at everyone's environmental scan. And just to let you know that, some of the environmental scans were not complete. So if respondents had flagged you, I wouldn't have been able to give you your grade because of the environmental scan not being correct. So let me show you. I do have a video on what the environmental scan should look like. But just to make sure, I will do an environmental scan for you. How do I change my background so you can see kind of everything around me? Here we go. So I'm going to put none. Okay, so you can kind of see my surroundings, right? So if you have a webcam that you can move, that's even easiest. But if you have like a desktop, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. So you'll have to kind of move things around. If you have a stationary webcam that's part of your desktop, then that's when having a mirror behind you so that it reflects back to see what you're doing would be important. Okay, but if you're taking the exam on the laptop, you would take, and again, sorry, this is not my house. This is my cousin's house because I'm babysitting right now. But you would go, what's important is for me to be able to see kind of what's to your right and what's to your left, and more importantly, the table, okay, that you're looking at. So you can see, so I can see that there's nothing there, no cell phones, no, no papers, and nothing like that. So essentially kind of your right and left of your complete workstation, okay? So you should do it so that I have no doubt whatsoever about, that there's nothing around you. All right. Let's go back to the respondents. Okay. So environment scan, make sure that you are doing it appropriately. There should be no paper around you except for your blank piece of paper and pen. There shouldn't be any cell phones. Any questions? Okay, so make sure you're doing an appropriate environmental scan. If you're not able to do an environmental scan, make sure you have that long mirror behind you so that I can see kind of what's in front of you, okay? All right, so that's the logistics. Then for the lecture exam, okay, it's the same format. You're gonna see one question at a time. You can move back and forth, but I really do not recommend that because a lot of you experience technical difficulties when you do try to move back and forth too often. So it's best to spend the appropriate amount of time on each one before you move on, okay? So you are able to move back and forth, but again, I don't recommend doing that. You will be seeing one question at a time, and there are 50 questions, of which 40 of them are multiple choice. And all the questions are grouped together. So for example, the chapter on skeletal, all those questions are going to be grouped together, followed by the questions on joints, followed by the questions on muscles, followed by the questions on the nervous system, okay? But do know that the muscle, it's about 2 chapters long, and the nervous is about 3 chapters long. So there's gonna be a little bit more questions on them because I divide them by chapters, okay? And then the last 10 questions are fill in the blanks. So you have 50 minutes to take it unless you qualify for extended test taking time. If you do qualify for extended test taking time, make sure before you start the exam that I have given it to you. I should have, and it should be reflected, but sometimes the settings get reverted back to where they were. So just double check before you take it, okay? To make sure that you are getting your extended time if you qualify. What else? It's gonna cover the skeletal, the joints, the muscles, and the nervous. It is 50 minutes. It's pretty much it for the lecture. Any questions about the lecture exam? Okay. Then for the lab exam, there's going to be 30 questions, and they're all identification. Okay. So essentially, they're going to cover things like bones, muscles, and then the brain and spinal cord. Okay. So the topic they're gonna cover would be the bones, the muscles, and the brain and spinal cord. Oh, and then there's also the dendrites. Okay. So not the dendrite, the nerve, the neuron, which consists of the dendrites. The neuron. Okay, so the brain, the spinal cord, and the neuron, and then all the muscles that you had to know, plus the bones. Okay.
Is it going to have the eye in the ear too?
Oh, thank you. The eye and the ear. Yep.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. And then what else? If there are some of the identification has multiple terms, like the posterior root ganglion or the posterior root, make sure all of the terms are in it. Do not put in more than one identification. Like, for example, 1 year someone put down the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, and it's clearly only one of them. So I can't grade questions or answers, responses that have more than one answers in them. So please be aware of that, okay? Even if the correct answer is in there, if you have more than one answer, then I can't grade that, okay? So, and then for the lab exam, spelling does count. So make sure that you are practicing spelling as well as identification. There's not that many. I don't think there's any this time, but they will be on the next exam. If there's a right and left, make sure you identify the right and left. Just try to be, how you see it labeled in your lab PDFs is how you should label it. And make sure that you use the terms that are provided in the lab PDFs. Okay, and that's why it's really crucial to study from the lab PDFs. Okay. What else? You have 45 minutes to do this one. And the exam setup is the same. You see one question at a time. You can move back and forth, but again, I don't recommend that. Make sure you double check your spelling. And within the question itself, like for example, in the last one, I saw some students write down names of tissues when it was asking for cell structures, organelles. So, kind of making sure you read the question so you know automatically what can't go in there. Okay. So like if the question is about muscles, you shouldn't put a term of a bone in there, for example. Okay. Any questions about the lab and the lecture? Okay. So same thing, I highly recommend using the 5-day plan, and that's why I tend to do these review sessions early on enough so that you can divide your days up and still be able to study, prepare for the final exam. So use this 5-day plan where you are only doing like one chapter or, one unit at a time. So for example, all of muscle in one day, all of nervous in one day, all of joints in one day, all of skeletal in one day. And I found after talking with a lot of you in this class is that you tend to save the most difficult for last, and then you don't have enough time to study them. So for this one, I highly recommend starting with muscles, nervous, whatever is the most difficult for you, and then going through skeletal and joints, which tend to be a little bit easier for people, okay? So start with the most difficult and go to the easiest. Normally I would say start with the oldest and then go to the newest because it's fresher in your memory. But because the muscle and nervous is there's so much content, it's best to kind of start with them early on so that you set aside enough time for them and continuously review them throughout the week. So use the 5-day study plan. Okay. So for skeletal, make sure that you know what types of bone there are. For example, what's a short bone, what's a flat bone, a regular and long bone. Now for these types, I can just ask you pure definition. So for example, if I say this type of bone has its width is less than its, I'm sorry, for this type of bone, its width and height is about equal. So width is about equal to its height. What kind of bone would that be?
Short bone.
Exactly. So that's some type of question I could ask is just pure regurgitation of the definition. Another type of question I can ask is, okay, let's take a look at your zygomatic bone. Your zygomatic bone would be an example of what type of bone?
Irregular?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so irregular bone, okay? So that's the type of questions I can ask from that type of question, okay? So another thing you should know is function of bones. So bones function in movement, particularly in association with muscles, because muscles pull on the bones and allow them to move. It also functions in stabilization because your bones is a framework. It allows for your muscles and your skin to kind of hang on, okay? And then it also functions in protection, like your thoracic cage and your pelvic cage protects your thoracic organs and your reproductive organs. Okay. Another function is red blood cell production. Where does that occur? Where does red blood cell production occur?
Is that in the marrow, the bone marrow, red bone marrow?
Exactly. Yes, it does. So it occurs in the bone marrow. And the bone marrow can be found where in, let's say, in a long bone.
The medullary cavity.
Excellent. It also allows for mineral storage, which is why bones, excuse me, to have healthy bones, you want to make sure you ingest what?
And colors. Colors, please. It's colors, huh?
So for mineral storage, what do you want to drink? Yeah, milk, right? So calcium. And that's because bone can store calcium. Okay, so it allows for mineral storage. Okay, milk. Yes, that's right on. Okay, so that's the function of bones. Okay, then of the 4 types of bones, we really focus a lot on the long bone. So on the long bone, make sure you know the anatomy of the long bone, know the structure and the function. So for example, you can draw out a long bone and label it.
Bone.
Yeah, that's a bone. Okay.
Bone for doggy.
Yes, you can give bones to doggies. This is going to be one of the most interesting recordings ever. Okay. So let's look at here. So let's start with this. So from here to here and from here to here, what would you call that? What are the ends of a long bone called?
Epiphysis. Yeah,
Epiphysis. Exactly. And then the shaft of a long bone is called what?
Is it diaphysis or?
Yeah, diaphysis. Excellent. Okay, so that's the diaphysis. And then the middle part of the long bone is called what? So this part right here. Number 3.
I think it's the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate.
Yeah. So it goes by 3 names. Okay. The layman's term is growth plate. And then the technical term has 2 technical terms. It can either be called the epiphyseal plates or the metaphysis. Okay. So you've got the epiphysis, the metaphysis, and the diaphysis. Okay. So the metaphysis or the epiphyseal plates are your growth plates. So this area, what do you need to know about that area?
that it goes away when you become an adult, or it fuses.
Exactly. So it starts off with cartilage, and when you hit puberty, and that's what allows you to get taller or to get longer, is that it converts from cartilage and it becomes bone. So let's say if you were in forensics science, for example, if you look at someone's bone and measure the metaphysis or the epiphyseal plates, you can, oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. There you go. You can determine their age if they're by the presence of the epiphyseal plates. Okay. All right. So those are some of the parts, and then we can go in even deeper, and we can say that there's a layer around the epiphysis. And what is that layer around the epiphysis called? What surrounds the epiphysis?
Is that the
Articular
periosteum?
That's not the periosteum.
Is it the articular cartilage?
Yes, it's the articular cartilage. Excellent. So the articular cartilage surrounds the epiphysis of a long bone, or the ends of a long bone, because that's where the articulation happens between two long bones. So when two long bones are kind of move along each other, you have to have the articular cartilage so that it doesn't rub against, the bone doesn't rub against bone, because that's very painful. So the function of the articular cartilage is to prevent bone friction. Okay. Now, someone had just talked about the periosteum. Now, the periosteum is found right here. So the periosteum, just like it's named, peri meaning around, osteum, the bone, the periosteum surrounds the diaphysis of a long bone. Okay, so the periosteum is made of connective tissue, and there's actually the outer layer is called the periosteum, but the inner layer is called the endosteum. So the outside is called the periosteum, and the inner layer is called the endosteum. And the reason why that's important is because the endosteum contains what?
Would that be blood?
Nope. I'll give you a clue. As an adult, when we fracture or when we break a bone, the bone actually is going to heal from the outside inward. Where when we're fetal development and we're developing the bone, it actually develops from the inside outwards. So what's the reason why it develops as an adult? It heals itself from the outside inwards. It's because the endosteum contains what? It contains what kind of bone cells that can generate new bone cells?
That be osteoblasts?
Not the osteoblasts,
Osteoclasts?
not the osteoclasts. Keep going. We have two more.
The osteogenic.
That's it, the osteogenic cells. And you know, I'm a really strong advocate of answering, and particularly if you answer it incorrectly, because you're more likely to remember it on the exam. Okay, so keep answering. You know, don't be afraid. This is the best time to get questions wrong. So yeah, it's the osteogenic cells that you find in the endosteum. Okay, and that's why as an adult, when we fracture or damage our bone, it has to heal from the outside inward. Okay. Great job. Now, in the center right here, there's a hollow space. What is that hollow space called? What's number 7?
Is that the medullary cavity?
Exactly. That's a medullary cavity. And what do you find in the medullary cavity?
The red and yellow bone marrow.
Perfect. When you're younger, it's going to contain red bone marrow, but as you age, it's going to transition from red bone marrow to yellow bone marrow. And then when you come really old, like in your seniors, it's going to become gelatinous. And that, you know, and I kid, but I'm like, you know, at my age, I don't have much red bone marrow left in that medullary cavity. It's yellow. It's because, you know, we start to gain more weight, and we start to deposit more fats. Okay. All right. So that's essentially the anatomy of a long bone. Now, if you cut it in half, so if I took a knife and I just kind of slice it in half like this, that's what's going to allow us to look at the microscopic anatomy of a long bone. Okay, so I'm going to try to draw it right here, recreate that, a slice of it right here. Okay. So this orange is still the same. Okay, so that's the 5 and 6. So that's the periosteum and endosteum, which makes this number 7. What's number 7 again?
Medullary cavity.
Perfect. Then within the diaphysis surrounding the medullary cavity, you'll actually see these smaller tubes. If I were to give you one pencil, can you snap it in half?
Yeah.
Yeah. If I gave you a set of 20 pencils that are lined along each other, so like, a whole bundle of them, can you snap that in half?
No.
No. So that's the premises of a long bone. So that's why the diaphysis area is very dense, it's very heavy, is because it has all these osteons surrounding the medullary cavity of a diaphysis. Now I'm going to pull one of those osteons out and I'm going to zoom in on that osteon. And this is the tricky part, is because it looks kind of the same. It's a circle within a circle. So the osteon looks essentially the same thing as the cut of a long bone. Okay.
Donut.
Yeah, that's a donut. Exactly. So here, this is the osteon at this point. Okay. So the osteon, now this center right here, I'm going to call it A. What will that A be?
The central canal.
That's right. Okay. So that is the central canal. Surrounding the central canal, you'll find these pockets.
We eat it.
So these pockets right here are called what? They look like a little lake.
Are those the lamellae?
Not the lamellas.
Oh, lacunae?
Yes. So the literal translation for lacuna is little lake, because it looks like a little lake. Okay. Now the lacunas are important because that's where osteocytes are going to be housed. Okay. So the lacunas are going to be little pockets that house the osteocytes. Okay. Now, off of the lacunas, there's these kind of channels, these little networks that connect to each other. What are these networks called?
The canaliculi.
They are called the canaliculies. Yep. So the canaliculies are these network channels that allow for things to move back and forth. Because the lacunas house the osteocytes, it's going to need nutrients, and it's also going to need a way to get rid of the waste. So all of that occurs in the canaliculies. Okay, so the canaliculies are these channels right here that connect the lacunas. Okay. All right, so those are the main structures that you'll find in an osteon. Now, the osteon has a lot of matrix. So in the osteon, you will find matrix. Someone remind me, what's the matrix again? What's the matrix again?
Number baby 4, huh? Baby 4.
What's the matrix? Two things make up the matrix. I'll remind you, ground substance and fibers. So what's the ground substance and fibers that you will find in bone?
Isn't collagen one of them?
Collagen is one, yep. And what's the ground substance?
Go, go, go. How about go?
I can't remember.
Calcium phosphate. So the ground substance that you find in bone is calcium phosphate, okay? And it's gonna look kind of like a Twinkie, okay? So it's gonna do something like this. Let's do it in purple, okay? So it's kind of like a Twinkie layer. It's gonna be these concentric layers of calcium phosphate and collagen. Now these concentric layers, these are called what? They are concentric rings of matrix. What are they called?
This one.
Are these the lamella?
Yes, they are. These are the lamellas. Okay?
Come,
right.
come.
So you've got the central canal. You've got the lacunas. You've got the canaliculi. You've got the lamellas. And what you'll find is the central canal goes up and down, right? So the central canal looks like this. Okay? Along the length of this osteon. But there's also a tube that goes perpendicular to it that allows the blood vessels to move through as well. So that area is called what? E, B, C, D, E. Similar to the central canal, but this one's in perpendicular to it.
The perforating canal?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how things fit in with each other. Okay, all right. So some terms you want to know.
This one.
Yep. So some terms you want to know are the types of cells. So we went through some of these already, right? Osteogenic cells. They're the stem cells. Where do you find them? You find them in the center during fetal development, and then as an adult, you find them in the endosteum. Okay. You have osteoblasts, B for building. So osteoblasts are the bone building cells. Osteocytes are the cells. They were the osteoblasts, but they become stuck. And when they become stuck, they're called osteocytes. And then osteoclasts are completely different bone cell. They don't like, so osteogenic cells become osteoblasts, and then the osteoblast becomes the osteocytes. So they're related to each other, where the osteoclasts are a cell of itself. So it doesn't originate from any of the other three. So the osteoclast is the bone dissolving cells. And the reason why it's able to dissolve is because if you look at these ends right here, they have these ruffled bordered ends that contains digestive enzymes that help to break the matrix apart. Okay. Make sure you learn about the bone tissue, that there's compact bone tissue and spongy bone tissue. Know the difference, be able to compare and contrast them. Where would you find them? What's their purpose? And then there are two bone formation processes that you want to know. You don't need to know much detail about them, but you should know what starting materials they use and how they work. So one of them being the endochondrial ossification, and the other one is intramembranous ossification. So within its name alone, you can kind of tell a lot about it. Chondrial, meaning it starts with cartilage. It uses a cartilage model. Okay. Endo, meaning inside. So this bone formation process starts from the inside outside. So you know that this happens during fetal development. Okay. During fetal development, and it occurs inside to the outside. Where intramembranous ossification, intra meaning between, membranous means it's a type of membrane. Specifically, it's called mesenchyme. Okay, so it's like a sandwich. So it builds where endochondrial ossification builds long bones, intramembranous ossification builds flat bones, because it forms kind of like a sandwich. Okay. All right. So I took this from my in class when I was teaching in class, and this is kind of like how I went through this material with my students as well. I kind of walk through where the connecting points are, what significance, how they relate to each other, and we talked about the parts. Okay, so see if you can do something like this and use this as a guide afterwards to make sure that you're on the right track.
Mom.
Okay. Then joints, you shouldn't have to spend a lot of time. Joints is a lot of memorization more than anything else, to be honest. The problem with joints, though, is that the terms, they all sound very similar to each other. Synarthrosis, synesmosis, synarthrosis, symphysis. So like all sins, right? So a lot of terms that sound very similar to each other. So if you create a cognitive map like this, you can kind of see where they are. Now, this is important in multiple ways. One, it allows you to differentiate between the different types of terms that look so similar to each other, but it also helps you to organize where the terms belong. So if on a test, I'm asking you what structurally it's made up of, I'm looking for these terms. If I'm asking you what type of joints, I'm looking for these terms. Versus if I'm asking for movements, I'm looking for these terms. If I'm asking for specific joints, then I'm asking for these terms. One of the most common mistakes on exams is that students switch them. So let's say I'm asking for what type of movement it is, and they tell me it's a suture. They are somewhat correct in that sutures are synarthrosis, meaning there's no movement, but that's not the term I'm looking for. They gave me the specific joint name where I want the movement name. Does that make sense? Questions? Questions? All right, so I'll send this PowerPoint to all of you. You can use this to complete the chart. But essentially for movements, one way I remember movements is that it makes me sad. S for synarthrosis, A for amphiarthrosis, and D for diarthrosis. So synarthrosis, no movement. Amphiarthrosis, slight to little movement. And then diarthrosis, freely movable. Okay? Questions? The last thing about joints is to make sure you know about the synovial joint. That is one that we highlight. And within the synovial joints, you want to make sure you can define and kind of know more about the meniscus, the bursa, the synovial capsule, the synovial cavity, and the articular cartilage. So for this, making a vocab list is a good idea. Okay, so under synovial joints, have all these vocab lists. And I included pictures just so that you can actually visibly see the differences between them. Okay. All right. So moving on to muscles, because I want to make sure I give you enough time to talk about the ATP portion, so the metabolism right here. Okay. There, I will say though that if you look under announcements, I did create a video. So if you go into announcements, go to Canvas, go under announcements, you will find a video on both the sliding filament theory and metabolism, which I think are two kind of the most difficult concepts in muscles. Okay. The first part on function and structure and the neuromuscular junction is just kind of memorization, knowing what the parts are and their functions. So the two main kind of the physiology component is the sliding filament theory and metabolism. Okay. However, you can't understand the physiology unless you understand the structure and the function. That, you know, it just doesn't work. And that's why it's really important to get this down first. It's just a way, a flow chart to kind of see how everything fits to each other. Here's the muscle, the larger muscle and its parts. And then I took the muscle cell, which is also more commonly known as the muscle fiber. I know it's really confusing. Whoever did this, did us dirty, because whenever I think of fiber, I think of like the protein fibers, right? No, here, if you see the term muscle fiber, it's actually referring to the muscle cell. Okay, so I expanded on what the muscle cell would look like and all the organelles. Here's another dirty move. They renamed everything. So the plasma membrane of a muscle cell has another name. It's called the sarcolemma. the cytoplasm of a muscle cell is called the sarcoplasm. So again, a lot of vocab. So the best way to process this is to do a vocab list.
Muscle.
Yeah, that's a muscle. Good job, Anne. She's only 2 and she knew it was a muscle, by the way. Okay, so let's see. And then I zoomed in. So when I look at the muscle fiber, aka the muscle cell, I recommend doing it in 2 layers because there's just too much things in there. So the approach that I took is to kind of go through the muscle cell as a cell. In other words, what are the organelles in there? Now, what makes a muscle cell unique is all the fibers that you find in it. And that's this image down here. So this is still the muscle fiber, aka the muscle cell. But now, you know, I put another layer on top of everything. So yes, it has all the organelles, the myoglobin, it has the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it has the mitochondria, it has everything, but it has an additional layer to that, and that's all the fibers that it has, which includes the myosin, the actin, the troponin, the trypomyosin, and so on. So make sure that you do understand this image conceptually before you do move on to the sliding filament theory, okay? Since there wasn't a request for the sliding filament theory, I'm not going to go over that because I want to make sure I save enough time for metabolism, okay? So this, you know, so the metabolism. So this busy picture right here, this is what I would have gone through with you in terms of the sliding filament theory. And the sliding filament theory does have 4 distinct events: excitation, excitation, contraction, contraction, and then relaxation. Okay. All right. So the request was for metabolism. So let's go through that. I'm going to add a slide in here. And let's talk about metabolism. Oh, I should say that the sliding filament theory, there is a video in the announcements for that as well. Okay. All right. So for metabolism, what is metabolism, first of all?
Yes,
What's metabolism?
It has something to do with the energy, like burning energy.
Yeah. Okay. So metabolism can actually burn energy or it can produce energy. So we say that metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. Okay. It can be in the form of catabolism, which is what we talk about here, or it can actually also be a form of anabolism. Okay. So that's metabolism. Technically, it is the sum of chemical reactions, which means it can either be catabolism or anabolism. Okay. All right. So in metabolism, okay, so that's kind of the definition of metabolism. Okay. So when we're talking about metabolism, we have to identify 2 main things. What is the energy source? And where is the energy coming from? So energy, in other words, energy source is where the energy is coming from, and how is energy processed? Okay. So in terms of energy source, we talk about, energy process or energy usage is the term that, oh, bless you, usage. Okay. So where does the energy come from?
From ATP?
Okay. So the source of energy that our cells use, so the cellular energy is ATP, you're right. But where does ATP come from?
From the mitochondria?
Yeah, so mitochondria. So the mitochondria produces or synthesizes the ATP, but that's not where the energy comes from. So where does energy come from? So whenever you feel tired, what do you have to do to kind of perk up?
Would it be from carbohydrates?
That's it. You eat. Exactly. So our bodies consume, and you're right. So our bodies convert everything that we eat, whether it's carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, but essentially it's going to convert to glucose. Okay. So you've got the raw energy, which is kind of the foods that we eat. And then your body processes it into glucose. And then we extract the energy from glucose to ATP. Okay. So kind of the big picture of things. And that's why you have to go through the way in which ATP is produced through glucose metabolism, okay, or carbohydrate metabolism, or more specifically, carbohydrate catabolism. Okay. So ATP. What's ATP? What does ATP stand for?
Adenosine triphosphate.
Exactly. So that tells you that there's one adenosine molecule and 3 phosphates. That's why it's called triphosphate. Okay. Now ATP itself is not energy. Okay. ATP itself is not energy. It's kind of like a flashlight. And in order for a flashlight to work, what do you have to have?
Batteries.
You have to have batteries. Exactly. So it turns out that these phosphates right here, they don't like each other. So in order to link this second phosphate to this first phosphate, a lot of energy has to be stored in this bond. Then to link a third phosphate onto the second phosphate, it even takes a lot more energy to link it together. So we extract the energy from glucose and we put it into these chemical bonds right here. Okay. So ATP technically isn't energy. It's just a way in which energy is stored. Okay. So your body produces it by taking the foods that you eat, converting it to glucose, and extracting the energy from glucose and storing it in these bonds. So you have ATP in your body. And when your body needs, your cells need energy, what it's going to do, it's going to take the ATP. What's it going to do?
It's going to take the energy from the glucose and
Nope.
no.
So if you're right, and if I were to ask you how is ATP formed, then that's how it does it. It takes the raw energy from the foods you eat, converts it to glucose, extracts the energy from glucose, and forms the ATP. Okay, in the bonds that keep the phosphates together. But if your cells needed to use the energy, like for every time you contract a muscle or anytime you use energy in your thinking processes, it's going to extract it from this bond right here. Okay, it's going to break that bond apart. And when it breaks that bond apart, it releases the energy. And that's what your cells use. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So then it goes from being ATP to a what?
ADP?
That's right. Adenosine diphosphate. And it
Okay.
loses that phosphate.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Isn't
That
it
makes a
cool?
lot more sense. Oh, that's
Right?
really cool.
It is so cool. So that means that if your body wants to establish this again, it goes back to this process of where it takes the raw energy, converts it to glucose, takes the glucose to reestablish that third bond back on and go from ADP to ATP. So it can go back and forth.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is. And here's even something cooler. If there's not enough time and your body consumes so much energy, what it can do is it can take it even a step further and go like this. from ADP to something that looks like this. What's this?
Will that just be AP or AMP?
AMP,
Ah, cool.
adenosine monophosphate. So whichever process your body goes through, once it's done consuming the energy, we have a process called it has to pay it back. So when it pays it back, once you've done your, like, let's say you're doing a marathon, once you're done, your body just shuts down and it has to restore itself. So in order to restore itself, you have to consume enough food for it to convert to glucose and extract enough energy to reestablish all these bonds so that every adenosine triphosphate that you broke down, you build back up again. Okay?
All right.
So, yeah. So this process of doing this to go from glucose all the way down to ATP, okay? So what you're going to do is that you're going to take glucose and you're going to convert it to pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid. Okay? This process is called glycolysis. Lysis meaning the severing, the breaking, glyco meaning glucose, right? So glycolysis is when you break glucose apart, you're going to break it apart into pyruvic acids, 2 to be exact. Okay, so this process right here does not require any oxygen. So no oxygen required. But from here onwards, pyruvic acid, if there is no oxygen provided, it's going to convert into lactic acid. There's only 2 ATPs produced in here. Technically 4, but then you use 2 in the first process, so the net gain is 2. Okay, so the net gain of this process from glucose to pyruvic acid to lactic acid is 2 ATPs. Not a lot at all. And as a matter of fact, lactic acid can build up and cause muscle cramps. So what you really want is for it to go through this process right here, where if oxygen is available, it's going to go from 2 pyruvic acid to 36 ATPs, molecules of ATP. Okay, but oxygen must be present. So we call this aerobic respiration, and we call this anaerobic respiration. Okay, or fermentation. So aerobic respiration goes from pyruvic acid with the presence of oxygen, it's going to become 36 ATPs. That's the most effective way to produce ATP. Okay. Questions? So that's energy source. So all of that information is energy source. Okay. If there is no oxygen available, so that's a no, by the way. No. Oops, I should have made that a little bit more clear. Hold on. Eraser. Oops, I erased too much. So if no O2 is present, then that's what happens. Okay? All right. Now, energy usage. You remember in the worksheet that I had you do, you had that graph, right? Of immediate, short term, and long term. Okay. So immediately, you're going to use all the ATP that you currently have produced already, that you already have in your body. But that's not going to be very long lasting. It's going to give you like spurts of energy of like 2 seconds, 2 to 5 seconds. Okay. Of which then you go to short term. And you can think of short term as kind of buying time. Because short term is going to go through this process right here, from glucose to pyruvic acid to lactic acid. Okay, it's not ideal, but it will at least give you 2 ATPs each time. What are you buying time for?
Would it be for the aerobic?
Yes. So you're waiting for your respiratory system to catch up. And that's why when you start working out, you'll feel real good for the first few seconds, like, oh yeah, I can do this. And now suddenly, we're breathing real heavily. You're breathing real heavily because you're in short term and you're trying to buy enough time so that your respiration can catch up and bring that oxygen to the cells, to the mitochondria, so that you can then go through the glucose, pyruvic acid to ATP pathway. This one right here. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That really helps a lot.
Excellent. That's
Yeah.
great. Okay.
That's awesome. Woo.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, but but it's super cool, right?
Yeah. No, that's awesome. But that's definitely kind of more the way that you've written it out is much clearer than the textbook. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Okay. So we do have a few minutes left. So the last 5 minutes, I do want to cover a little bit of what you should know for the nervous system. Okay. The very first thing you should do to make it just a lot smooth going is to do this right here. Okay. That will kind of give you a map of everything you're going to study. You have to understand how things relate to each other. So the nervous system has two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is straightforward. It's the brain and spinal cord. Where the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves. And we're like, oh, it's just the nerves. The central should be more difficult, right? Because it's the brain and spinal cord. No, my friend. The nerves are the most difficult part. So within the nerves, like all the nerves that you have in your body, it's divided into two main types, sensory and motor. What does that mean to be sensory?
Is that the tactile portions?
Expand on that. What does that mean?
That means like touching, feeling, like the
Yeah, it turns out it's part of it. So what you just told me was the somatic sensory. So you told me a specific division within sensory. But sensory just pretty much means that the direction in which the information is going from the outside to the inside. Okay, so it's going from the outside to the central nervous system. So sensory just tells you the direction in which information is carried.
Okay. Nice.
Where motor is also the direction, but in the reverse. So motor nerves carry information from the central nervous system to the environments. Okay, so the reason why what you told me was only this part of the pathway right here, okay, is because you're talking about things from the external environment. But sensory also includes things that are internal environment, like blood sugar levels, like pH levels. Okay, so somatic is like the touch receptors, the being able to detect temperature outside, pressure, and such. But visceral sensory is the inside of your body. It also sends messages to your brain. Okay, so that's sensory. So sensory just means it's going from peripheral to central. Where motor means it's going to carry information from the central nervous system to the peripheral, to the internal or external environment. Now, within the motor peripheral nervous system of the nervous system, it's divided into somatic and visceral as well. So within the motor somatic, these essentially are your voluntary muscles. Okay, it's going to go to your skeletal muscles. Where the visceral, this one right here, is a particular kind of difficulty. And my highlighting is probably not going to make a difference, but you should be able to see a little bit. Okay, so the visceral is more complicated. It's divided into what's called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Oh, by the way, your visceral is also known as your ANS, your autonomic nervous system, all completely involuntary. Okay. So your somatic is kind of like your flight or fight response. It's what stimulates you. Okay. You don't have conscious control over it. So let me give you an example. If you're walking in the dark and all of a sudden you hear a noise like rustling in the back, your mind just goes wild, wondering what the heck that noise is. And even if you didn't plan it, your muscles tense up. And that's because it's involuntary, but it's your jerk reaction to you're getting ready to either like run the heck out of Dodge or stand your ground and fight. Okay. So that's your sympathetic nervous system. Where your parasympathetic nervous system is your rest and digest. And it's very real. Where it's like, some people, they can only use the restroom when they're at home. Okay. And that's because when they feel safe, when their bodies are allowed to like rest, they can either digest or they can rest their nervous system. And that's the parasympathetic. So for example, when you eat a really large meal, like Thanksgiving, you eat a really large meal or any type of celebration, like New Year's or such, you eat a really large meal. And what's going to happen is that all your blood is going to be drawn into your digestive system, because really you can do one or the other, either you're sympathetic or you're parasympathetic. So you get really lethargic when you eat a large meal, because why? It's switching to the parasympathetic, which means it's going to let you rest so that the blood can go to your digestive system and help you break down the foods. Okay. Now let's say traditional American. Okay. So Thanksgiving, you're eating a really large meal and you're watching football, and you get food indigestion because your body's trying to fight, which system it's going through, either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic. Okay. All right. So that's the basics of it. Make sure you know about the spinal cord over here, how many nerves you have, the parts of the spinal cord, and how a neuron, whether it's a sensory motor neuron, would fit into it. Okay. Then know the parts of a neuron. So the dendrites, the soma, and the axon. And then know the brain, the parts of the brain, how it's divided. Okay. This one's also a difficult one. So I think what I'm going to do is hopefully by tomorrow, I will make a short video clip on this one because it is kind of difficult. I don't have one on it yet, so I'll have to make one for you all. But it's about the nerve impulse conduction. Actually, I think there was a student that chose to do this video for this. That was really nice, and I might just use theirs instead. If I can't find it, then I'll make one for you. But the nerve impulse conduction is the physiology part. It's the how of things work. So this one you want to make sure you understand as well. I do believe I have a cognitive map of it though. Here it is. Okay. So if you're like not quite sure about it, all of this right here is on that. Okay. So if I have one board and it's more than half of the board that I focus on, it's big. It's a big concept. Okay, so make sure that you do go through electrophysiology.